Okay, so it's a great pleasure to have John Lavis, who is the director of McMaster Health Forum and professor of McMaster University, and Jeremy Grimshaw, who is a senior scientist and professor of the University of Ottawa. So this is part of this Science and COVID-19 that we are holding together between Federal University of Health Science of Porto Alegre and Federal University of São Paulo. And so we're very glad to address a topic that is very highly regarded as top 10 insights into how COVID-19 can help you support decision making. And maybe Flavio can say something about this relation between Brazilian universities, especially UFCSPA, as we call it, and McMaster. That this is probably part of the first step.
Right. So we are working in an MOU between McMaster and UFCSPA, and that was, people from UFCSPA would come and visit us, but with the COVID, everything, we couldn't move forward so far. But the idea is to create some sort of platform for interaction, exchanging faculty and students, and eventually facilitate joint projects. So that's the project I was working with Ayrton before this whole crisis of COVID, came and changed everything.
Okay. Thank you, Flavio. So you can start, John, your lecture, and hopefully, as Flavio has said, that we can try to build up this relation between our university and McMaster, and I'm sure others can join. I have already talked with George Barreto and try to see if we have a link between Fiocruz, our university, and McMaster. So
well, that would be great. As I was saying before we started this lecture, Georgie is one of our favorite colleagues in the world, and we've had the great privilege of working with him now for around a decade. So we would be delighted to further strengthen our connections to Brazil with you, Flavio, and others. So thank you very, very much for having us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy. Jeremy's going to cover the front end, and then I'll move into some of the later slides, and then we'll open it up to see if you have any questions. So Jeremy, I'll turn it over to you, and just let me know when you'd like me to advance the slides.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ayrton, for this invitation. So welcome to our Brazilian friends and colleagues. It's a great honor to present today and tell you about some of the work we've been doing to try and create a global evidence synthesis response to support societies as they grapple with COVID. So I'll have a few background talks, comments before we move on to the slides, really to tell you how COVID-19 came about. So COVID has been an unprecedented challenge for societies and healthcare systems around the world. And given that this was a completely new virus and the extent of the pandemic and the rapidity of the pandemic, it has raised many questions about how we provide care for patients with COVID, how we use public health measures to reduce the risk of infection and transmission, and also at a societal level, how do we support citizens and society to both survive during and after COVID. So there are many, many questions that are coming up constantly at this point in time. And the good news is that the global research community has responded with great vigor. There has been a huge mobilization of research covering all of these different areas that we mentioned. One of the problems that this creates, though, is really a sort of noise to signal area or problem. It's very hard for a clinician or a public health decision maker or a minister to make sense of individual studies being reported to at any point in time when the next day there might be a different study that would contradict the original study. So yeah, the way that we try and address that is by using evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, developing guidelines, health technology assessment, innovations, and to really argue that they should be the unit of knowledge to inform decision making. Individual studies are potentially misleading or maybe biased. Also, it's very hard to run perfect studies, especially at this point in time. So when COVID struck, John and I, with another colleague, Rob Reed, were working on a project to support some health transformations in our province, and they quickly were put on hold. But we started to think about, well, where is the trustworthy evidence that could be used by decision makers to think about COVID? And John started to just create an inventory of trustworthy sources that he thought we should be promoting in Ontario, our province, but also much more widely. One of the things that became very apparent when we looked at what was out there was that there's a huge amount of synthesis activity. Lots of people were potentially doing syntheses of the same topic at the same time. The quality of those syntheses were variable, and it felt like there was a real opportunity to try and promote collaboration and cooperation and reduce inappropriate duplication of effort in the global evidence community. So we convened a call with a number of the leading evidence synthesis organizations in the world, like Cochrane, Campbell, the Epicenter, Prospero, and basically asked them, did they recognize that there's a problem with, basically a duplication of effort? Could we work together in a more coherent way? And they uniformly agreed that something needed to be done to try and address this sort of these problems. And that's how COVID-End was born. Actually, John, could you go back a slide?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's how COVID-End was born. So we are a time-limited network of evidence synthesis organizations from around the world that has come together in response to this exogenous shock that COVID-19 represents to advance the evidence ecosystem. When I say time-limited, we hope that in 2 years' time, we no longer have to exist. We have created the evidence and know how to manage COVID, so that once we're at that stage, we will basically cease to exist. What COVID-End is trying to do is make the most of the interest, the explorative interest and demand for evidence synthesis, and we'd really like to see if we can reduce that noise to signal ratio problem. We also would like to see whether if we can get the evidence ecosystem, the evidence community to work better during the time of COVID, that might lead to a more robust and resilient evidence community in the future. And we also wanted to strengthen existing institutions and processes. We are not trying to compete with a Cochrane, a Campbell, a Guideline International Network. We want to basically sort of support them, highlight their work, and hopefully help them strengthen what they're doing. So again, they're going to be well equipped in the future. Next slide, John. So these are just exactly some of the partners who are currently involved in COVID-End. And hopefully what you can see from here is we have a lot of the major evidence synthesis organizations, as well as sort of guideline organizations, and also health technology assessment organizations. We also have organizations that are predominantly evidence intermediaries who are working with decision makers in their jurisdiction to support the use of evidence to inform decision making. We also are geographically diverse, so we have partners in Africa, in China, in Southeast Asia, in South America, as well as in the North, and as well as international organizations. So we're trying to be very inclusive and very broad, recognizing that many different players have incredible contributions to make. Next slide, John. We have a number of principles that underpin our work, and we thought it's worthwhile just highlighting these. So first of all, we want to support not compete or replace well-positioned organizations. We also want to, with that, support with a common brand and identity, a small agile secretariat, and a simple working group structure, a distributed network of organizations and individuals. So again, they can contribute most effectively to this global challenge. And we also want to find quick wins, things that we think we can do in weeks that will enhance the global effort, as well as making sort of, or trying to identify longer term solutions that we can work on over maybe months. So I'm going to hand over to John, so he will tell you sort of what progress we've made to date. One of the things that I have to keep pinching myself about is we're only now 6 weeks old. It feels like it's 6 years, but it's only 6 weeks. And John will sort of basically give you an idea about what we've been able to do in those first 6 weeks. So John, back to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. So I'm going to walk through 9 ways that we think COVID can help, but we'd warmly welcome thoughts in the coming days and weeks from our colleagues in Brazil about what else we can do to better support activities in Brazil, but as well as in other countries. So this is what I'll walk through. So normally I'm a fan of 10, so I often go through 10 points, but today I'm going to go through 9 and then leave it to you to add the 10th. So the first way I think we can help is with our website. So it's covid-end.org. So that reflects the name of the network, which you'll see in the logo in the top left corner of the slide. Based on feedback that we received in our first few weeks of operation, we restructured the site. So it now specifically tries to meet the needs of 2 target audiences. So one are those supporting decision makers. So we know that the Evidence Shop at the World Health Organization uses the site to find the high yield, high quality sources of evidence about COVID when they have to prepare for a 5 o'clock media briefing. We know many ministry staff around the world use the resources that are available through the site. Locally here in Ontario, we use it as part of our contribution to government decision making here. And we are hoping that our colleagues that are part of VIPNet, the Evidence Informed Policy Network, like Jorge Barreto and others, might find resources on the site to be helpful in their work directly supporting decision makers. The other group that we're trying to support are researchers. So ones that are not necessarily in a direct supporting relationship with decision makers, but researchers who are trying to bring their skills to bear on this once in a lifetime crisis. Many of these groups are coming forward with, as Jeremy indicated, tremendous enthusiasm, but we're seeing a huge amount of duplication and often a lack of coordination. So we're aware of at least 10 groups in the world that every morning are searching the global literature. There are many groups doing duplicative reviews. So a few weeks ago, when we began preparing rapid evidence profiles about using different types of masks, just in the preceding week, we found more than 30 rapid reviews that had been done on the exact same question related to masks. So a heartbreaking amount of duplication. And what we think would make more sense is that when a question comes in, or a researcher identifies a question, that they look to see what's already out there. If what's out there is already of high quality, they can adapt it to their context and say, what does this mean for us in Brazil? If it's a little bit out of date, they can update it, but really try to stand on the shoulders of folks who might be a few days or weeks ahead of you in pulling together what we currently know and don't know. The second thing we've done is created 2 versions of a guide to COVID-19 evidence sources. We originally had a single one, which kept growing ever longer and longer and longer and longer as more and more hubs came online presenting research evidence. that very extensive guide is now the second one in the list, and we think of this as being a guide helpful to researchers so that they can look for opportunities to avoid duplication and enhance coordination. So we call that the Guide to All COVID-19 Evidence Sources. But at the request of the World Health Organization and other groups directly supporting decision makers, we prepared a second version of the guide that points people to the high quality, high yield links. So with our own supports to our local governments, we're now preparing what we call rapid evidence profiles in as quickly as 3 hours. So this is where we go and we systematically work through those high yield, high quality links to see if there are existing guidelines, existing technology assessments, existing evidence syntheses, existing protocols for evidence syntheses, and in their absence, single studies that speak to the question. So if you are involved in supporting decision makers, we'd highly recommend you look at the Guide to Key Evidence Sources, which we update quite frequently. The third thing that we've made available that might be helpful to you are what we call tips and tools. And again, we've segmented them into tips and tools for those supporting decision makers and tips and tools for researchers. The tips and tools for researchers probably wouldn't be that helpful for a very experienced researcher like Ayrton Stein, George Barreto, who know a tremendous amount of how to do high quality evidence syntheses, technology assessments, and guidelines. These are more for the tremendously enthusiastic researchers coming into the field of COVID-19 wanting to help, but not necessarily being familiar with the leading edge of how to conduct high quality evidence syntheses, technology assessments, and guidelines. For those, though, that are working at the front line with decision makers to support their decision making, we have a different set of tips and tools. So our colleagues at WHO, folks like us working with ministries, our colleagues like Georgie and his colleagues with a VIPNet might find these tips and tools most helpful. And we've kind of grouped them into 3 sections. So 2 of the tips are about making sure you have the right team and the right relationships in place. And that means both having connections on the evidence demand side, so having those existing relationships with decision makers, but also relationships on the supply side. So you might be quite experienced with a certain type of evidence synthesis, but you might want to partner with other individuals or teams that have complementary experience with other types of evidence syntheses. 6 of the tips focus on creating the right processes to respond to requests from decision makers. And I'll just highlight 3. So, and all of these are based on our very direct experience trying to respond to urgent requests from decision makers in as little as 3 hours. So one lesson is start with the guide. So we have found these high yield, high quality sources that if you only have 3 hours, these are the ones that we find get you the highest yield and the highest quality results. Second, look for quality rated products. So there is just an abundance right now of rapid reviews, but many of them are essentially opinion pieces, someone quickly pulling together a couple of resources. So we're using currently Amstar as a way of rating the existing evidence syntheses. You might have a different approach, but we would encourage you to rate the quality of the products that you are citing. The third thing that we were asked by our decision makers to include was the recency of the evidence. So ideally, we document the recency of the search, because if a guideline, technology assessment, or evidence synthesis did its search on the 1st of April, the science is moving so fast that you would probably pay much less attention to that document than one for which the search was conducted on the 30th of April. So we used to be happy with a citation that included the year, Then we were happy with the citation that included the month, and now we're working very hard to provide the exact date. So the 19th of April, 2020, because the science is moving so fast. And finally, two of the tips relate to the right balance between being reactive and proactive. So we are getting, in the early days, we were getting many questions about masks, about screening and so on. But now we're increasingly realizing that we need to be proactive in identifying the questions that we can predict will emerge in the coming days and weeks. And there's a balance there between reacting to what decision makers are struggling with on any given day, but proactive in being aware of the issues they'll likely be needing to address in the days, weeks, and months ahead. The fourth thing that we've done is prepare a four-part taxonomy of decisions related to COVID-19. So we found it very difficult initially to kind of wrap our head around where might the evidence synthesis needs be in the coming days, weeks, and months. So this taxonomy has helped us a lot, and we distinguish public health measures, which are what have dominated in the first few months of the pandemic, so infection prevention and control. So that would include masks, screening, a variety of different things. Clinical management of COVID-19, but even more importantly, perhaps in the coming months, related health issues. So unmanaged chronic conditions because people have been unable to take care of themselves, seek health care. Mental health issues, an emerging problem. Family violence, another emergent problem related to lockdown. The third area are health system arrangements. So right now, many of the questions coming into us are about restarting non-COVID-19 activities in hospitals. How do we restart ambulatory clinics, cancer treatments, elective procedures, but also more forward-looking questions. So I'm not sure if it's the case in Brazil, but we managed to do in a few weeks in the area of virtual care, things that we had not been able to do in 10 or 20 years in our health system. So we're now asking the question, how can we maintain and build on the gains achieved with virtual care? And then finally, the economic and social responses. So we are on the cusp of a fundamental reimagining of what education looks like, what financial protection looks like, what food safety and security looks like, housing, recreation, transportation, and evidence can help with all of those. So the taxonomy lays out a mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive list of decisions, and we're hoping to begin to use it to create a one-stop shop of the evidence so that you can zero in on what is known in a very particular type of, let's say, public health measure. So we think the taxonomy can help curate existing evidence products. And as I mentioned, we're exploring the possibility of creating a single searchable portal using the taxonomy as filters. We think it can help inform the prioritization of questions that need to be answered as issues emerge. So we were thrilled to find out yesterday in a call with the World Health Organization that Cochrane is now using the taxonomy to sort the questions that it is receiving where Cochrane reviews are needed. We hope the taxonomy can also inform the prioritization of evidence products that should be kept up to date for the foreseeable future. So we're starting to see living reviews, living guidelines take off. Our colleagues in Australia, Julian Elliott, Sally Green, and others are maintaining a living guideline about the clinical management of COVID-19. And finally, inform the prioritization of evidence products that might be needed at some point in future phases of the pandemic and pandemic response. So we are likely to be entering and re-entering different phases, and we think that the taxonomy can be helpful there. The fifth thing that we wanted to describe to you is one of two innovative models, and we think there are many out there, and the COVIDend website would welcome people to submit innovative models of how they are bringing evidence to decision-making about COVID-19. So if there is an interesting model in Brazil that is being used. We would be delighted to include a description of it on the website. Right now, the model that is described on the site is one that we have been piloting, a rapid evidence model that we feel can be used or adapted in any jurisdiction. I alluded to it before. You can produce these profiles in as little as 3 hours. And they highlight both the evidence, and that comes from the review of existing guidelines, systematic reviews, rapid reviews, but also innovations, which comes from jurisdictional scans. So there are now several sources in the world that you can go to understand what different countries are doing right now. Doesn't tell you whether it's effective or cost effective, but for jurisdictions that might be weeks or months ahead of you in the pandemic, it's sometimes helpful to know, oh, they tackled this in a particular way. And hopefully over time, we'll have research about whether that way was in fact effective. I've given you 3 examples of what we've dealt with. So what screening approaches can be used in non-healthcare settings to identify people who may have COVID-19? What are some lessons learned about reopening non-COVID-19 activities in hospitals? And what's known about strategies for supporting the use of masks under shortage conditions? But if you want to see the full link, you'll be able to click on the hyperlink in the slides. The 6th thing is something that we're going to start piloting soon. It's what we call an evidence contextualization service. One of the things that has happened with COVID is that we often fall back on our bad habits, and a bad habit that obsesses me in particular is what I sometimes call GOBSAT, which I think was a term that originally was brought forward by the founding chair of my department at McMaster, Dave Sackett. GOBSAT stands for Good Old Boys Sitting Around the Table. So it's experts saying, here's what I think you should do. But we know that experts, often their personal advice conflicts with the available research evidence. And we think experts do have a critically important role. But that role is, we think, most helpfully focused on interpreting what the evidence means for your context. So even if I produced a rapid evidence profile based on the global evidence, what it means for my province of Ontario is different than what it will mean for Ayrton's state in Brazil. And so the evidence service is a way of quickly bringing content and context experts onto a call to say, okay, here's what we found. What do you think it means for us, both in general, in our country or state, or for particular populations? So in Canada, we always ask the question, what would this mean for First Nations, Indigenous peoples living on reserve? Very different context, and the implications might be quite different. The 7th thing that we're doing that might be helpful to you are convening working groups to achieve and document quick wins, and as Jeremy indicated, also work towards longer-term solutions. So you'll see the 7 working groups here. The 1st and 7th are kind of bookends to the core activities of COVID-N. So the first one is setting out the scope. So we intentionally set the scope broad. It includes the full array of considerations in low, middle, and high income countries, the full array of not just public health, not just clinical management, not just health system arrangements, but also the full economic and social response that cuts across all sectors. The sustaining group is asking, how can we use this once in a lifetime shock to our system to strengthen existing institutions and processes so we're even better prepared for the future? We have a concern that we will build one-off solutions for COVID that collapse in the months and years ahead as people return to other areas of focus. We think anything that we do in this space should be about strengthening existing institutions and processes. But then we also have groups focused specifically on how can we engage groups like AVIFNet in making use of all of these resources that are now available. how can we digitize different aspects of the system of evidence production, synthesis, and translation into guidelines. Synthesizing, how can we better conduct and report on rapid reviews? Recommending, how can we, for example, quality rate guidelines so we can better judge which are trustworthy? And finally, packaging, how can we better package evidence for different contexts and different languages? So if there are leaders in Brazil like Ayrton, like Jorge, and others that see a connection between areas that they're passionate about and the work of these working groups, feel free to contact us, and then we would introduce you to the co-chairs of the working groups, and they then are making decisions about inviting people into their respective working groups. Some of the achievements of those working groups that are starting to come online, the Engaging Working Group has identified more than 20 networks globally that we're going to start to be regularly engaging. AVIFNet is one of them. Digitizing is currently soliciting input on what are the biggest barriers that we're facing in providing a timely evidence response, and saying focus on the barriers, don't worry about what the digital solution might be, we'll then think about whether digitization may help. The synthesizing group is further elaborating our current draft of the tips and tools for researchers. The recommending group is taking steps to a global guidance repository with quality ratings, and the packaging group has drafted principles and a resource list for those that are packaging evidence for their local context or in their local language. We're 90% sure we're going to go with a listserv option, but a final decision won't be made next week, but we will be launching a community of practice open to anybody in the globe for those who are supporting decision-making about COVID-19. So we hope if you come to the website that sometime next week, you'll see information about how to join this community. Again, we think it will be a listserv, but we'll confirm that soon. We would be thrilled to see lots of Brazilian colleagues join that community, share your lessons learned, but also pose questions that others can answer. So as I mentioned before, we're a work in progress, very open to feedback about how we can do better or do our work in ways that will achieve greater impact. So if you have ideas that would be applicable to Brazil, we'd warmly value them. And as I said before, we'd warmly welcome the active engagement of the best and brightest in Brazil, of whom there are many, and of whom I've had the good fortune to work with some. So just a reminder about how COVID-19 can help. Same slide as at the beginning. Keep up to date or share your insights with us by going to the website, following us on Twitter, or sending us an email. So that's the run through. Jeremy, do you want to say anything else before we open it up for questions?
Perhaps the other thing I'd like to say is just to remind people that we're 6 weeks old.
We're just babies. Yeah, we're just babies. We look older than babies, but we're just babies. So Ayrton, Jorge, I see you've got another colleague, Karine, who has joined, and I think her hand might be up, so that might be an error, but if any of you would like to ask a question, please do.
Karine, she's a colleague from my university, Federal University of Health Science of Porto Alegre, and she is also in the organizing committee. Can you say something, Karine? Are you online?
Hello, this is a mistake that I raised my hand. Thank you for Ayrton for inviting me, and sorry for my delay. Congratulations for the big project. I think it is necessary to join efforts to all these groups to have more information and good evidence to support the decision making in many countries. Thank you, and congratulations for your group.
Right. I have several questions, but Georgie, would you like to ask first?
Thank you, Ayrton. Thank you so much, John and Jeremy, because this presentation shows us about a very, very relevant initiative to articulate many things, important things to address in COVID-19. I have 2 or 3 points, and just to add to discussion. The first one is we have an increased way about the pandemic, and on the other hand, we have an increased way like an infodemic environment. We have increase in the availability of papers and preprint papers and information and data files, etc., etc. And we need a good taxonomy to categorize these. And I think COVID have a good way in this need. I think we have general interest related with general questions and general issues that is very related with national levels and systems decisions. But we have a lot of implementation questions, and that is very related with local issues and local needs. In this, regarding the local needs, we have a very specific questions like how we can introduce endotracheal intubation in primary healthcare. Should I do that? And then other kind of questions that I think rapid response can help a lot of, but we need to have confidence about how and what we are doing. I think in Brazil we have a good experience with the local groups of VIPNet and other groups supporting the local government to do this kind of rapid response. Thank you so much by the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And you know, do keep in mind that, you know, you from Fiocruz, perhaps Ayrton from his university, if you are, you know, willing to join us at COVID, we would be thrilled, and we'd love to see your logo up on that second or third slide. But I would very much agree with you on your 2 points. The point about the infodemic and the importance of using a taxonomy to kind of help us to organize what's out there. And then secondly, the huge array of local implementation questions. We're finding the same in Canada, but I agree with you that because of how thoughtfully you have built up a VIPNet with the national focus, the state focus, and the municipal focus, you're probably better prepared than most countries to have that kind of local evidence support, which is great.
John? Maybe I could just say a couple of things to your question. Again, I agree largely with them. One of the things through COVID is we are bringing together groups that can then start to work on some of these sort of issues that you're raising. So as John mentioned, we're on a call with WHO yesterday, and they're trying to coordinate much better basically the ongoing searching of to identify COVID-specific information, and also to think about like metadata and how we can retrieve that. So at the moment, it feels like we're in a blizzard with just lots and lots of things flying at us. But we're aware through COVID of partners around the world that are really trying to make that much better. So that's one point about how we might address this sort of information explosion. But I think also there's a kind of when you were talking about the infodemic, I was also thinking about how this pandemic is being presented to the general public and a lot of the misinformation that's out there. One of the things that we've been struggling with a little bit in COVID is how do we engage with some of those more citizen or patient-facing groups, and who are they within that? So Evidence Synthesis Ireland, who's one of our partners, has developed a very good Mythbusters sort of or fact-checking approach, and there are other groups across the globe doing that. But we're still, I think, trying to think about what are the things that could be done that would help the citizens who are trying to understand what's going on globally. And I think the second thing that your comment about implementation is absolutely correct. So one of the things that we've distinguished between in COVID is COVID-specific and COVID-relevant reviews. So COVID-specific reviews are reviews that are, basically of evidence that's emerging as societies and systems try and deal with COVID. But there's actually quite a lot of evidence that predated COVID that can help us when we're thinking about public health and implementation issues. So, for example, there are reviews on improving hand washing, etc. And in fact, a lot of the Cochrane reviews that have in their special collections are reviews that were done pre-COVID, but they are COVID relevant. So again, there's information out there that we can potentially use that might be helpful. But I think also what you're highlighting is that I think we need to actually sort of have a much stronger emphasis on behavioral, social, economic, and implementation research during the pandemic, so that we can address some of those specific issues that you're identifying.
May I ask one question? John, when you were in Brazil, a professional from the Ministry of Health in Brasilia asked you that the Ministry of Health performed good quality synthesis of evidence, but in several occasions, the decision maker do not follow the instructions. And what I recall, you responded to her stating that the decision makers, they are in charge of making the decisions, and they were elected, and if the results are not good enough, they will not be re-elected. But in Brazil, as you know, for instance, we have had 3 Ministry of Health in the last 90 days, and the leadership is very awkward, to say the least. Would you change your remark? I'm not sure if I recall it rightly, what you stated.
Well, I wish I could, but I don't know a better form of governance than democracy, and sometimes democratic elections yield governments that as individuals we may very actively oppose. But governments are subject to elections periodically, and your national government will be subject to an election in a few years. But in the shorter term, there are opportunities for society to bring pressure on leaders that are not acting appropriately. And there are also lots of opportunities for leaders to spring up in many other places. So there are many municipalities in Brazil that are probably doing lots of superb work guided by robust research evidence. And while we would like in federal jurisdictions like Brazil and Canada for all 3 levels to be working perfectly at all times, it's almost never the case. So I do think that with democracies, we're not always happy with the way that things play out, but when people are in power, they're able to make decisions, and when society is not happy with those decisions, they need to mobilize and use, legitimate forms of pressure to try to change their views. And there was a famous political scientist, E. Schattschneider, who said, politics is all about trying to change where the political battles are more likely to play out in your favor. So if you're unlikely to achieve wins at the national level now, you refocus all of your energy on municipal and state level activities because that's where you're most likely going to have an impact while you try to bring about changes at the national level. So unfortunately, as someone trained in political science, I'll stick with my answer. But I do think that, political science tells us how important it is for societal mobilization, for being prepared for elections, for working in environments that are more conducive to evidence at some moments than others. There's no easy solutions here, but and Brazil is not alone in having leaders who are not always making decisions based on the best evidence, but we need to keep trying to push them in that direction. Very long-winded answer.
Yeah, leaders who are not fit for the job, I would say.
You can say that. I try not to comment on other countries' politics.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I was invited just yesterday to address an interview for Argentinian TV, as most neighbor countries. They are very worried about the Brazilian policy in terms of lockdown strategies. And I said it's best to interview people from local municipalities who have done good jobs in terms of surveillance. And of course, there are several good examples in Brazil. Just do not stick just to the federal government policies. I enjoyed your presentation and your proposal. In one sentence, it's one-stop shop, isn't it? That's what you want to address for this entrepreneurship. But the problem is one size fits all. People tend to identify a simple solution for a complex case, isn't it?
Ayrton, maybe I could respond a little bit to that. So I think we are trying to provide a one-stop shop, but also we're working with partners who have reach into many countries, many jurisdictions, who are often much more sensitized and aware of the local contextual issues that you're talking about. So we see we're providing one resource, but actually, in reality, the work is really being done by these global partners who are hopefully being able to sort of fit solutions to the context of jurisdictions that they're working in.
Yeah, and I just put up the first principle is very much that we should support well-positioned organizations. So Covidend is simply trying to make it easier for Jorge Barreto, others, in your case in Brazil, who have very, very close existing partnerships with key target audiences. It's trying to make it easier for them to do their work, but also to bring their voices into Covidend to hear about things that might be happening in Brazil that other groups can learn from. But I agree, at the end of the day, these decisions need to play out in countries, in states, in municipalities, in local communities, in local organizations, and it will look different. But the general approach to bringing the best global evidence into the conversation, I think, is very important. But it needs to be accompanied by that effort to contextualize it to whatever that local setting is.
One aspect that countries such as Brazil, but it's not only in Brazil, inequity is a big issue. Mm-hmm. And in this pandemic, and a colleague from Harvard University, he said that this pandemic is highlight the inequity in the countries, and exclusion is very likely in terms of economic, but not only economic, as the recession will be certain after this period. Do you have any suggestion on how to tackle this issue, or how to review articles that could help how to proceed in order to decrease inequity?
Jeremy, do you want to jump in first?
So a couple of comments, Ayrton. So John has put up the taxonomy, and you can see that the fourth area that we have highlighted are economic and social responses, and it's precisely to address this issue that whilst at the moment our focus is very much on the health impacts and the health system impacts of COVID, the probably much bigger shock that the world will face is actually the economic and social issues that arise as a result of this. So, the first thing we would say is, there are bodies of evidence, some of which are, most of which are COVID relevant rather than COVID specific, but that may give us sort of insights into how to provide distance education, what sort of economic stimuli might be able to support the individual at the least advantaged individuals in societies. So we very much sort of recognize the issue you're facing, and we would like. And one of the things in Covidend is that we have been very clear from the start that this isn't just a health or a public health issue; it's a health, public health, and social and societal issue, and we need to address all of those different buckets. So we would say, from our perspective, that societies, when they're thinking about this, should be trying to use the available evidence to inform their social and economic policies, using for their health and public health policies, but also we'll need to generate evidence about the effects of different sort of policies and whether they have in fact helped to reduce or minimize the effects of inequalities on outcomes and social well-being, or whether they're making them worse. So I think there's a mixture of, let's use the evidence base we have now to help us think about the problems and identify potential solutions. But also, I think, again, we're going to need a large primary research response to sort of understand whether the things we're putting in place in different countries actually are particularly useful. And just to come back to John's comments, I mean, clearly what we need to do is sort of trying to encourage all levels of jurisdictions to be trying to use evidence, both at the national, the regional, the community, the civil society. So it probably also means that we have to think quite carefully about the target groups and how to engage them so that people are aware that there's already substantive evidence out there. John?
Yeah, I have the taxonomy up, just to remind myself, if nothing else, about how inequity has played out in such a powerful way. Public health measures, the brunt of them were often faced particularly by lower socioeconomic groups. So it's easy to live through a lockdown if you have a large second home that you can get away to, or you have a large house with a swimming pool. It's very difficult to live in a very crowded apartment with many, many other people. Clinical management too, the distribution of masks and other things in healthcare settings likely to be very unequally distributed. Health system arrangements, same thing. But the economic and social response also just very powerfully. Many of the people around the world that have been affected are people in precarious employment, and so their financial needs are extreme, and the food issues in terms of hunger are very pronounced. So I agree very much with you, Ayrton, about how important equity is, both in the distribution of the burden of COVID, but also in the way that the responses are playing out. So I think it has to be kind of a governing focus for much of how we approach both the science, but also how we approach the use of the science in decision making.
Yeah, and I always recall executive summary by UNICEF, and it was published on The Lancet in the end of 2019, identifying the main aspects of the future of the world's children. And one of the highlights were, of course, health, education, development of child's lifetime, but essentially about climate. What is the perspective of this pandemic and the change of the climate, and how is this issue is going to be on the agenda in the future?
When you say climate, do you mean like climate in terms of warming and everything?
Warming, yes, sure.
Yeah. Well, I guess, this to me is the biggest shock to our economics and social and health systems in a generation, if not a lifetime. One thing that I've started to say, I've increasingly started to pay attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it strikes me that the Sustainable Development Goals need to be front and center in how we conceptualize the economic and social responses. So I don't know that we will ever have another opportunity to fundamentally rethink education, financial protection, food safety, housing, recreation, transportation, but also how we approach the environment. So this is an unbelievable opportunity to start to think from a sustainable development perspective about how we approach this reconceptualization. So to me, COVID is this exogenous shock that has now created an opportunity for sustainable development thinking to come in and guide how we move forward. So I think our future could be very bright if we take advantage of this once in a lifetime opportunity to reconceptualize all spheres of society. But it could also be very bleak if we fall back into old habits and we don't keep climate action and other sustainable development goals front and center as we move through the economic and social response. So it's both the greatest opportunity that we face, but will be particularly devastating if we don't seize that opportunity.
Yeah, sure.
And John, just one comment to make is that the collaboration for Everest on the Environment is also a partner of COVIDend, which again highlights that, first of all, there are syntheses out there that are relevant to good environmental management, but also that this is a kind of key area that in a post-COVID, or the COVID and the post-COVID world, we'll need to address, but we can again use an evidence-informed process to inform that.
Yeah, sure. And in Brazil, it's a big issue as everyone's attention is on the pandemic strategy. The government is not really doing proper job in terms of preserving the Amazon rainforest. So this is a big issue in the country to highlight that we need to protect the rainforest. I'm not sure if Georgie and Karini would like to ask something, because is packaging a new word for dissemination? When you presented, for me, it resembled dissemination, packaging.
Yeah, so you're right. We probably could have called it dissemination. It's covering many things. It's covering how do you package evidence for a local context? How do you get it into multiple languages? But also how do you combat misinformation? So as Georgie indicated, we have an infodemic. We have a tremendous amount of misinformation. So for whatever reason, we ended up calling it packaging. It felt like it was a bit more active than just disseminating. But I don't think any of us feel strongly about the words. But it's something about getting the right types of information to the right people in the right way, in their own language, and also actively trying to combat misinformation. So it's a small word, but a lot of stuff is covered under that one word.
I think it recalls me when you explain now the word clustering, isn't it? You have to identify different clusters in the community.
Exactly. So so we find that these 5 clusters, these are the working groups that are doing the core of the activities around trying to avoid duplication and enhance coordination, and they're almost like they're their own little evidence ecosystem. So the recommending group, those are the guidelines people, the health technology assessment people. The packaging are more people with experience in communication and so on. These are almost like micro communities within the bigger evidence ecosystem that know how to talk within their community and know what needs to be done. And they're trying to share their lessons learned, but also learn from other people about how they can do better.
Yeah, sure.